President Donald Trump has unveiled a sweeping new tariff policy targeting most U.S. trading partners. The plan will set at least a 10% tariff on nearly every country in the world. Some countries will be hit harder than others. President Trump and the White House shared a series of charts on social media showing the tariff rates they say other countries impose on the U.S. and how the U.S. will reciprocate.
How did they get to those tariff rates? I think that when we figured out that was a little puzzling because what we have confirmed now is the way they got to those rates. There's the formula. It looks kind of complicated, but it's actually rather simple. They took the trade deficit, the administration took the trade deficit and divided it by the imports from that country to the United States, and then assumed that number, that rate that they got, was all the ways that they're ripping us off, whether it's currencies or taxes or tariffs.
To a lot of trade experts, Kelly, it's gibberish. That's really the problem. And I called up these trade experts and I said, have you ever heard of this? And they said, no. Do you know anybody who's ever used this formula to determine?
That didn't seem like too many arguments. It did seem like they had a bunch of random symbols to make it seem fancier than it is, but I think it was just 3 symbols, a couple of which were reused in the numerator and the denominator. So it didn't seem like that complex of math, generally speaking. I think if they had just written out the words, it would have made so much more sense and it would be very clear. So maybe they'll be covering that later in this video.
The trade burden or onus or whatever, and everybody said no.
A White House official told reporters on April 2nd, these tariffs are customized to each country and the numbers have been calculated by the Council of Economic Advisors using very, very well-established methodologies from the international trade economic literature as well as policy practice. The model they use is based on the concept that the trade deficit that we have with any given country is the sum of all the unfair trade practices, the sum of all cheating.
We were all trying to figure out, is this based on value-added taxes? Is this tariffs? It doesn't line up with any known applied trade policies. It took people who weren't actually steeped in this day to day to say, hey, this is just correlated with trade balances. The White House is naming all of these policies they're supposedly reciprocating against. Those show up in no form or fashion in that formula at all. It's simply just looking at bilateral trade balances in goods, which has nothing to do overall with trade policy.
The administration calculated each country's tariff rate using this formula. The tariff rate equals the U.S. trade deficit with that country divided by the U.S. imports from that country. For example, the U.S. claims that China charges a tariff of 67%. The U.S. ran a goods trade deficit of $295.4 billion with China in 2024, while imported goods were worth $438.9 billion. When you divide $295.4 billion by $438.9 billion, the result is 67%, just like the graphic the administration posted.
Chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life. It's a very great threat to our country. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating, but we will charge them approximately half of what they are and have been charging us.
The idea was essentially that any type of trade deficit that the U.S. economy would have with any trading partner would be perceived as essentially an unfair advantage that the U.S. would be given to another economy. And that's why they use the trade deficit relative to imports from that economy as the basis for these reciprocal.
Something probably worth noting, since they haven't explicitly described it, they did cover it quickly, but again, the trade deficit is basically where two countries, while they're interacting, they import and export relative to each other in different degrees. And obviously they're doing this to other countries as well, and these all get varying levels of tariffs and amounts that they're paying towards them and how many goods are moved around. But the trade deficit basically means that we are buying more things from the other country than they are buying from us in this case. And that's where the deficit comes from. And the opposite would be true unless they are exactly equal, which is very unlikely for any country to be perfectly equal in their trading. Because, for instance, you might trade more raw materials with one country and then maybe trade completed products or assembled products to another country. And so maybe one of those countries you end up having a deficit with, but then the other one, it's the opposite. And so that's what they're primarily using there. And the reason why they're saying that this is maybe not great for America is essentially the idea would be US dollars or dollars from the US are going out to that country and not as many dollars are coming back into America. And that's what the trade deficit basically is. And so effectively what they're saying is we want our spend going outside of the country to be equal to or presumably less than what those countries are putting into America. And that's what he's using this basis of.
Tariffs. When you're just focused on trade deficits vis-a-vis trading partners, and you're trying to bring these trade deficits down to zero, you're essentially starting a trade conflict that is very similar to what we call as economists a beggar thy neighbor type of policy, because every other economy is going to want to react in the same fashion and thus impose its own tariffs. And so what that leads to is an environment where the general cost of doing trade globally increases, inflation dynamics are reignited, and that leads to demand destruction globally. So we end up in a world that experiences higher inflation and lower growth. And that type of policy is detrimental to US economic activity, but
this is something interesting that I'm not sure if I fully appreciate the implications of these things, but something that they just covered, and it's exactly what we have been seeing in America because some of these policies have been on and off in the recent weeks and months. And so basically what he is describing is the fact that once one country increases their tariffs to offset this trade deficit, the other country is also going to want to increase their tariffs to kind of make things more even and potentially even get it back in line with where it is. But I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing in and of itself, because if that is true, like if we can take that as at face value, which I think is exactly what we're seeing, what that means is that the countries who are profiting in these trade agreements want to keep profiting, which makes sense. They are earning more money than what they are losing from trading. And so if that is the case, then I don't know if I see what Trump is doing is all that bad, because if what we're saying is every other country wants to have a positive trade with America, and America is saying, well, we don't want everybody to have a positive trade with us. We would like the deal that you have, which is we would like to be positive in our trading with you. Then that seems fair, basically. I think that's where it doesn't sound outrageous. It doesn't sound like anything these other countries aren't doing. But this is where things get a little bit more complicated, going beyond just that face level argument, is labor costs, material costs are different. So that's where like one country might have more natural resources in a particular segment than we do, or compared to other countries, and we might need those goods more or less than other goods at a particular time. And labor is another key factor. This is one of the big reasons why we purchase so many things from China, for instance, is because labor costs are so low there that we're able to get goods way cheaper than we could have them in America. And that's why we make those trades. And that's why we send more money over there, is while there's a trade deficit that exists, it is still net positive for American consumers because those goods would be cheaper than if they had been purchased in America. But that's exactly what tariffs are there to offset, which is they're trying to artificially increase the price of goods, let's say from China in this case, so that people will buy more goods within America or potentially other countries. And so it is very complex. I'm not sure if I'm particularly leaning one way or the other, but I think the fact that people are having reciprocal tariffs and they're pushing to have and potentially maintain this trade deficit with the US trade deficit for them, it doesn't seem all that bad that Trump is necessarily going after them and trying to raise tariffs in general. This is supposed to be covering the math, and I think they haven't quite covered exactly what is a better way of doing the math, but I think if one country is doing it and that is okay, then it should be okay in both directions.
Also global economic activity.
President Trump has made it clear his goal is to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but that could be a slow process.
This is just the latest episode in a years-long era of supply chain volatility that we have seen drive major firms to already shorten and diversify supply chains to the United States. We expect the tariffs to continue accelerating that trend. That being said, this uncertainty in trade policy, along with other areas, is driving a lot of other major corporates to pause investment decisions, pause leasing decisions because of the uncertainty involved.
Economists warn.
Yeah, this is a big piece. I've spoken about this in other tariff videos, and I'm sure we're going to have many more of these as this is an ongoing topic in America right now, is that it takes months to years to make changes to manufacturing processes and supply chain, and it can be on the order of magnitude of billions of dollars in order to make those changes. And so in a world where 1 week there's a tariff of a certain percentage, and then the next week they pause it and don't make that change, and then the next week after they change the number, it's very hard to figure out where is the break-even point for a business or the profitability marker for a business. Because in America, they're going to basically run these calculations, and you as a business owner would say, okay, if these tariffs exist, this means goods will generally increase this much in my segment. Therefore, I need tariffs to be this high in order for me to invest and make that money back from this investment that I'm going to make over so many years. And so these would presumably, I would have to expect to be like 5+ year plans for return on investment. You're probably not going to make and invest $1 billion or more into some changes for your manufacturing and expect to make that back in the first year. So these are usually large monetary and time investments. And so you're going to wait until sort of the dust settles. And they had highlighted how Trump has mentioned this is something that he's doing specifically for this purpose. But obviously, this behavior going back and forth is detrimental to it because it's going to delay the start of it. And the other part is, I'm not entirely convinced that that's actually what he's aiming for at this point in time. In some cases, he might be using these tariffs as sort of financial pressure to push onto other countries for other policies he has. And it's not clear that he's actually going to long-term enforce these tariffs beyond just using them as part of his negotiation tactic. And so this is where businesses are not going to commit when they don't know for sure that they're going to get that money back. Because there's a likelihood or a possibility where they can invest $1 billion into a new manufacturing plant, and then Trump rolls back the tariffs, and then now they just invested all these money and they're not going to make that back, and maybe even cause them to potentially go out of business or put them at risk of going out of business. And that's not something people want to do.
Warned that a trade war could have serious implications for the U.S. and the global economy.
The tariffs will create a tax burden on the U.S. economy, and it will be shared by workers and by business owners. Some companies may be able to pass their tariff costs on to retail prices. Others won't. They'll have to eat that cost. It reduces their revenues, their profits, which means they might have to cut hiring. They might have to cut returns to shareholders. So in either way, whether the cost is passed forward or passed backward, it's American workers and American business owners who bear that burden.
We're now going back to an era where essentially each country would be forced, in a sense, to produce more domestically, even if that leads to heightened inefficiencies and a higher cost of trade globally.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.